Welcome back, everyone. I'm building a game called Where Beasts Were Born, which is based around evolving creatures. In my last devlog, I showed how my generator creates animated creatures from random DNA strings. I also showed how it can merge this DNA to allow children to inherit properties from their parents. I may have scared away some of you when I showed that the creatures can already climb on walls and ceilings as well. In short, the last devlog was full of creation, life, loving relationships, and their beautiful consequences. This devlog, on the other hand, will be gruesome. The reason is that for evolution to work there must be selection, so this video is all about trials, pain, suffering, and death. I advise everyone who wants to have a good time to leave now and watch something else. You have been warned. To the brave souls remaining, welcome to the beautiful, horrifying, and fantastic world of Where Beasts Were Born. For evolution to work, there must be selection. Until now, I used very simple fitness functions to rate the creatures of every generation. For example, the creature's body size. The result was that the creatures evolved larger bodies over time. In real life, the definition of a fitness function would be a lot more complex. It would likely involve some measure of how well a creature can reproduce and copy its own genes to its offspring. Usually, a prerequisite for reproducing is actually being alive. So, we could say that the lifespan of a creature is a relatively good first indication of its fitness, because the longer it lives, the more chances it may get to reproduce. In Where Beasts Were Born, a creature's survival will mainly depend on its reaction to a sudden encounter of a player's longsword, axe, or fireball. I don't have any players at this point, so for the sake of this devlog I created a simple magical turret that shoots ice balls or something at the closest creature. Now the goal is to evolve defenses against these turrets. For this to work, the defensive systems need to be controlled by the creature's DNA. So I slightly modified the creature's armor system. I created proxy objects that define which parts of the creature are covered by scales and which are not. The placement and size of these proxy elements are controlled by the DNA. The DNA also controls other aspects, for example the color, scale size, scale density, and scale thickness. In the game, thick, dense armor protects the creature best, but also slows it down the most. I also gave the body parts individual hitboxes. When a part is hit, it will take damage and pass a percentage of that on to other parts. In this way, non-vital parts like the legs can die off without immediately killing the creature. I told you, this would be gruesome. To maximize the damage a part can take, there are two basic methods: increase the volume or add more armor. In this example, the head, which is protected by scales, takes less damage than the unprotected leg, which quickly dies off. The neck is considered vital, but is also unprotected, and we can exploit this to quickly kill the creature. Lastly, I added some sound and procedural impact effects. This still needs some work, but I do like where it's headed. Alright, we have all the tools. Now we need to set the scene. I lovingly call this level the pit. There is a small defensive camp setup, mainly because I thought without any proper barrels in my game, no one will take me seriously. The pit is small, dark, and when I zoom out you will see that there is no escape. And in a bit we'll place the first generation of creatures into this level and watch them die. The rules are simple. We'll place 5 clones of the same creature into the scene and see how long they stay alive. Those who stay alive the longest will be the parents of the next generation. Here's a lineup of the random generation that we'll start with. At this point, I do want to remind you that I haven't given the creatures any brains yet, so there's a decent chance that they won't feel a thing. It might be fun to pause the video here and think about how you expect the creatures to evolve. The first creature type is relatively small and seems to have 4 legs. Wait, 1, 2, 3, where are the other 2? 4, 5. I place them randomly into the scene and let them choose their own waypoints. In a moment we'll turn on the turrets and see how they do. And they're gone. The second creature type is much larger and they do seem to have some armor, but the scales are fairly far apart. They can definitely take more hits than the previous ones, but they also die quite quickly. This next type is really fast, so I had to quickly pause in order to have a better look. These long legs make them good runners, but the problem is that running away is not an option in this scenario, so it doesn't really help them. Before I fast forward a bit, I want to show two more creatures that I liked in particular. These first ones that have elongated front legs, almost as if they could pick up a player and throw them around, and the second type has a beautiful purple shimmering armor. Sadly, both of them die out quickly, but hey, at least they looked great. So now if you use those creatures with the longest survival time as parents of the next generation, they pass on their genes and the overall survival time increases as generations go by. Now we can go back and see what actually happens to the creatures. Here in Generation 3, the first thing you'll notice is that they have gotten a lot bigger. If you look closely, they also have a lot more scales and bigger heads. Some of this is only possible because I allow genes to sometimes mutate randomly as well. Here, if we activate the turrets again, you'll see that it now takes quite a while to destroy all 5 creatures. When we look further into the future, we can see that the lifetime keeps increasing for a few more generations before plateauing at some point. I let this run for 32 generations, and at this point you'll see that the creatures have developed massive heads and massive bodies in order to maximize the number of hit points. When I turn on the light, you'll see that the head and neck are now covered by a thick layer of scales. As you'll remember, these are the creature's weak points, so I was very happy when I first saw this happen. Because of their armor and massive volume, the creatures have gotten very slow. As you can see, their survival method is extremely successful and they stay alive for a very long time. When we look at the statistics, we can see that indeed body volume had the largest impact on lifetime. However, we can also see that other factors, such as the scales, were optimized as well. Now, increasing your maximum health points is a pretty straightforward solution when trying to stay alive longer. Let's see if we can change the rules slightly to evolve more interesting traits. First, we'll now place all of the creatures from a generation into the scene at once, so they now compete against each other directly. We'll also place them all at the bottom of the pit and set their waypoint on the ceiling so that they all climb up the walls. The other rules stay exactly the same. Here you see all the creatures from the first random generation lined up at the bottom of the pit. When I start the simulation, they all search for the shortest route to the ceiling because I told them to. Now, because the turrets always target the closest creatures, those that are slowest will get targeted first, while those who ran up the wall survive the longest. After 3 generations, not a whole lot has changed yet, except for 1 or 2 creatures maybe being slightly faster. In Generation 9, we see the magic happen. Suddenly, all of the creatures are very fast and frantically head for the walls. Remember that none of this is scripted, it all happens because of the way the scene is set up and the fitness score we chose. In the last generation, most of the creatures are tiny and all of them are very efficient runners. Plotting the speed over the generations shows that the maximum seems to be reached at around 21 meters per second, which is almost 3 times the initial value. If you were watching closely, you may have noticed that the lifespan did not actually increase this time, even though we're still using it as a fitness score. This is likely because the fastest creatures are only good at surviving if slow creatures are behind them and take the damage for them, and these slower creatures die out over time. This dependency between creatures is actually a great transition to the final experiment that I want to show today. One thing that I would really like to be part of the game is co-evolution. Simply put, co-evolution means that species influence each other's evolution. I think it would be fantastic if creatures in the final game could evolve traits that complement each other, so I want to try what happens when I let 2 species evolve at the same time in this early stage of the game. So far, we've tested a generation of creatures and then let them all breed to create the next generation. Now we'll introduce a second species, which is also initialized randomly, and evolves alongside the first. The only thing that we really need to do is make sure that these two species cannot interbreed. Another thing I did was to place the two species at two different starting positions, the outer ring as species 1 and the inner ring as species 2. Before I tell you the outcome, I want to show that I recently signed up on Patreon, so you can now support this project financially if you want to. I'm doing all of this in the little free time that I have. Your support would allow me to make more free time or to outsource things that don't need to be done by myself. So, if you want to see all this pointless death actually turn into a fun game, please consider donating. Okay, back to the game. In Generation 1 we don't see a lot of interesting things happening yet, except that my 10-year-old laptop is slowly dying while trying to simulate and record this at the same time. Species 2 gets decimated quickly, while Species 1 is initially left alone by the turrets. In Generation 9, many of the creatures in Species 2 are already much faster. Since they choose their path randomly, many of them run into the center and die. But some of them manage to escape, and this is enough to let the genes which make the creatures fast pass on into the next generations. And after 99 generations, things look quite different. Species 1 has evolved large and slow bodies, and Species 2 has at least one member that zips around so fast that it breaks my animation system. If you watch the last few seconds here closely, it looks like the last surviving creatures are actually members of both species. Now this might not really be considered co-evolution yet, because one could argue that similar strategies would arise if the species evolved on their own. But if we look at the average lifetime, it's already clear that they somehow influence each other's survival, which I thought was a cool starting point for future experiments. I rendered out all of the creatures of this last experiment for both species. You can download high-resolution versions of these on my Patreon page. The link is in the video description. Let me know in the comments what other things you'd like me to try out, and please do feel free to like, subscribe and share the video, ideally with your 3 geekiest friends. And I really hope to see you again soon, in the land where beasts were born.